This debate sometimes is interpreted as saying that companies aren't paying enough tax, and actually if you look at the figures that were released this week, it shows that they are. For example, the tax burden has gone up by 50% in the last 30 years globally, if you compare it with GDP. And if you look at the UK, companies are paying about a third of all the tax take, and of course they generate employment income, etc. on top of that. So what we need is a business to be functioning, producing jobs. What this debate is about is whether the rules that were introduced in the last century are really fit for purpose with modern business, and whether the right country is able to collect the tax.
Well, what we're talking about is that governments, particularly the G20 nations, need more money, and companies want to pay less tax. That's what we're talking about, and they'll look at ways legally, they'll look for loopholes in which they can get away with paying as much tax as possible.
Companies will always be trying to manage their cost base, and that includes tax. But I think the real issue here is that what we're seeing is that the rules were designed in the last century, and what they would say, for example, is that a company that is based outside the UK and is selling into the UK will pay tax in its home jurisdiction and not in the UK. And so there's a question in the digital age where often goods, services are being sold over the internet. Is that right? So it's right that we have a debate, but let's remember we need to be careful what we ask for, because if the rules were changed significantly, and it would be a fundamental change, it could mean that UK-based companies would be paying less tax, because the tax then would be collected overseas where they're selling their goods and services.
So if a client comes to you and says, right, Mr. KPMG, I want you to advise me on how best to get away with paying huge sums of money in tax to various governments, would you advise them perhaps where to set up shop, where to set up their headquarters to avoid paying huge lumps of money?
We'd advise them on their business strategy. The client will obviously decide where it wants to operate and how, and depending on which way they structure themselves, it will affect the tax take. But tax is not usually the key driver. If you look at all the surveys, they show tax is about the fourth or fifth important factor in deciding where to locate a business. But it is going to be important, and that's why it's so important that we have a competitive rate in the UK. There's some really good news here that KPMG released a survey recently showing that the UK now is considered the #1 place to locate a business for tax purposes.
Could that change? Could that change with what's been discussed in Moscow?
Well, I don't think so, because what the Chancellor has said repeatedly is we need international coordination to make sure that everybody's applying the same rules. That's not going to stop the UK having a competitive regime, and that's what we need so that businesses come and stay in the UK and generate employment and wealth in the UK.